There comes a time when every human being finds himself faced with the question of control. We like to believe that our lives are steady ships in calm waters, that the maps are drawn, the sails set, and that we are competent captains. Yet it does not take long before the winds shift, the sea rises, and we realize that we are far less in command than we thought. The illness we never planned for, the disappointment that slipped past all our calculations, the sudden loss that no amount of foresight could avert, these things remind us that life was never truly ours to master, and it is precisely in this recognition that the invitation is made clear: leave everything in God's hands. This does not mean indifference. To trust is not to abandon reason, nor to shrug away responsibility. We are not excused from choosing rightly, nor from laboring diligently, but we are asked to recognize the limits of our effort. The gardener tills the soil, but he cannot command the rain. The student studies, but she cannot decree the outcome of every examination. The parent guides, but cannot guarantee the path of the child. Sooner or later, we stand at the edge of our ability and must decide whether anxiety will rule us or faith will carry us. To place everything in God's hands is to exchange the illusion of control for the reality of providence. There is a peculiar freedom in such surrender. Think of a child who falls asleep in the back seat of a car while the father drives through the night. The child does not stay awake to ensure that the road is straight, nor to check that the fuel is sufficient. His rest is not carelessness but trust. In the same way, the heart that knows God's character finds its repose not in certainty of circumstance, but in certainty of Him. It is not a matter of convincing oneself that all will go according to personal preference, but rather that all will unfold according to divine wisdom, which is infinitely more secure than preference could ever be. Our difficulty arises because we often mistake delay for neglect and mystery for abandonment. If an answer is not immediate, we assume the heavens are silent. Yet time is not the tyrant of God. He who stands outside of hours and years does not hurry as we do, nor does he falter. What seems long to us may be precisely timed in eternity. The seed underground does not sprout the day it is buried. It must endure darkness, cold, and the press of soil before the green shoot emerges. In the same way, much of what we commit to God must be hidden in patience before it blossoms into sight. To leave everything in His hands is to believe that the delay is not waste but preparation. And there is also the matter of mystery. If we could see the end from the beginning, there would be no trust at all, only observation. Faith would vanish into calculation. But God, in His wisdom, gives us enough light for the next step, and rarely more. He asks us to walk by trust and not by sight, because sight alone cannot sustain love. Love must rest in the beloved's character. Thus, when we place our future, our plans, our fears, and our unanswered questions into His hands, we are choosing to believe that the One who shaped galaxies also numbers the hairs on our head, and that such intimacy is not careless but intentional. The world will tell us otherwise. It will say that surrender is weakness, that to rely on anyone, least of all an unseen God, is folly. It will urge us to grip tighter, to orchestrate every outcome, to bend every circumstance by sheer force of will. But even those who succeed by such striving discover in time that power is fragile. Health, wealth, influence, all the tokens of self-mastery, these can vanish in an instant. What, then, is truly secure? Only the hands that neither grow weary nor fail. To place everything in those hands is not weakness but wisdom, not the abdication of life but the gaining of it. And perhaps this is the most beautiful irony. When we finally cease our frantic holding, we find ourselves held. When we stop striving to manipulate every thread of the tapestry, we discover that the design was already more magnificent than we could imagine. To leave everything in God's hands is not to lose ourselves, but to discover the truest version of ourselves, creatures not made for fear, but for trust, not fashioned for despair, but for hope, not destined for chaos, but for a kingdom where all things are woven together for good. True freedom begins when we release the illusion of control and rest in the certainty of God's providence. True freedom begins when we release the illusion of control and rest in the certainty of God's providence. We are creatures born into a world that teaches us from the very beginning to seize, to plan, to structure, and to master every detail of our existence. From childhood, we are told to chart the course of our futures, to measure our worth by how firmly we can hold the reins of life in our hands. And while there is wisdom in diligence, there is also danger in presumption. For the truth is that control, as we imagine it, is a fragile dream. Circumstances shift without asking our permission, events rise and fall in ways no foresight could predict, and even our own hearts betray us with desires we thought we had mastered. The tighter we cling, the more we feel the sting of our own limitations. It is in this tension that the invitation emerges, not to abandon responsibility, but to release the illusion of sovereignty and discover a deeper kind of freedom that lies not in our grip, but in God's hands. When we try to control everything, we find ourselves exhausted by a task too heavy for human shoulders. We imagine that with just a little more effort, a sharper plan, a stronger resolve, we might finally arrange life into a perfect order. Yet every achievement carries the shadow of uncertainty. Every success trembles under the threat of collapse. A career that was secure can crumble. A relationship carefully nurtured can falter. A body once strong can suddenly weaken. The very fabric of existence resists our attempts to hold it together, reminding us that we are not the authors of the story but characters within it. Freedom does not come by denial of this truth, but by acceptance. When we acknowledge that providence belongs to God alone, we step out of the tyranny of anxiety and into the peace of trust. This peace is not passive. To rest in God's providence does not mean that we sit idle, abandoning effort or responsibility. It means that our work, our choices, and our endeavors are no longer driven by the fear of losing control, but by the joy of faithful obedience. The farmer tills the ground, but he knows he cannot summon the rain. He labors because faithfulness requires it, but he entrusts the harvest to the hand that governs the seasons. The student studies late into the night, but she knows that her worth is not bound to the examination result, because her life is held by a hand stronger than paper and ink. The parent guides the child, but with humility recognizes that the child's journey is shaped by a providence that stretches beyond parental wisdom. To rest in God's providence is to act responsibly without demanding omnipotence, to live diligently without bearing the crushing burden of ultimate outcomes. The human heart longs for certainty, yet the strange paradox is that our frantic attempts at certainty often bring greater restlessness. We obsess over plans, strategies, and contingencies, convincing ourselves that if we just prepare enough, no storm can surprise us. But storms always come, and often from the direction we least expect. To release the illusion of control is to stop preparing for every possible storm and instead trust the one who commands the winds and waves. It is not that we abandon planning, but that we recognize plans are tools, not guarantees, and that their security lies only in the God who holds tomorrow. True freedom begins when we stop enslaving ourselves to the endless cycle of what if, and rest in the assurance that nothing arrives without first passing through divine providence. There is a sweetness in this rest that no amount of self-mastery can equal. Imagine a child walking beside a parent through a crowded street. The child may be tempted to wander off, believing he sees better paths, brighter lights, or more enticing sights. Yet when danger arises, when the crowd presses in, the child instinctively reaches for the parent's hand and finds safety in that grip. In a similar way, we may spend our days believing that we are charting our own courses, making our own way, but sooner or later, we discover that the only true safety lies in the steady hand of God. To live in this reality is to live with an unshakable confidence that even when our path twists into valleys or climbs into steep places, we are not abandoned to randomness but guided by providence. We might resist this surrender, fearing that to place our lives in God's hands is to lose ourselves, to become passive observers of a story written without us. But it is quite the opposite. Only when we release the illusion of control do we discover the truest freedom to live as we were made to live. When we are no longer enslaved by the fear of outcomes, we can love without calculation, serve without hesitation, give without clinging, and walk forward without the crushing need to know every step ahead. The certainty of God's providence does not diminish our humanity but restores it, freeing us from the chains of fear and placing us in the light of trust. It is not weakness to rest in His providence. It is strength, because it draws upon a source beyond the fragility of human power. And so the freedom that begins in surrender is not a lesser freedom, but the greatest one we can know. It is the freedom of a heart no longer tossed by the winds of circumstance, the freedom of a soul no longer enslaved to the anxieties of tomorrow, the freedom of a life anchored in the unchanging character of God. We discover that control was never the prize and that the real treasure was always trust. For to rest in His providence is to live without fear, to walk without despair, and to breathe without the weight of outcomes pressing down upon us. It is to discover that the hands that hold the universe are the same hands that hold us. Delay and mystery are not signs of neglect, but part of God's perfect preparation and wisdom. Delay and mystery are not signs of neglect, but part of God's perfect preparation and wisdom. One of the greatest challenges to human faith is the passage of time. We live in a world measured by hours, days, and years, and we instinctively assume that waiting is wasted time. When our prayers are not answered quickly, when our hopes remain unfulfilled, when the door we have been knocking on stays shut, we are tempted to believe that heaven has grown indifferent. Yet delay is not divine silence, and mystery is not abandonment. To the God who exists outside of time, what feels slow to us may be right on schedule in His eternal plan. What seems hidden to our eyes is often the very thing that is forming us into who we must become. Consider the seed buried beneath the earth. To the casual observer, there is no sign of life. Days, even weeks, may pass with nothing visible happening. Yet beneath the soil, in silence and in darkness, transformation is taking place. The seed is dying to itself so that new life can emerge. Roots begin to stretch downward, unseen, long before the first green shoot breaks the surface. If one judged only by appearances, one might assume that nothing was happening at all. But in truth, the hidden work is more vital than the visible. In the same way, when God delays His answers, He is not absent but preparing, shaping, strengthening, and planting roots of faith deep in our souls so that when growth comes, it will endure. Our impatience often betrays our perspective. We see only the present moment and demand immediate satisfaction, but God sees the whole story and works with an artistry we cannot fathom. A child may beg to receive a gift he cannot yet handle, but a wise parent withholds until the time is right. The parent's refusal is not cruelty but protection. Likewise, God's delays are not neglect but care. He withholds not to punish us but to prepare us, not to deny us joy, but to ensure that joy arrives at its proper fullness. Were we to receive certain blessings too early, we might misuse them, misunderstand them, or be crushed by the weight of them. The delay is mercy disguised as waiting. Mystery, too, plays its part in the life of faith. If God explained every detail of his plan in advance, trust would be unnecessary. Faith would collapse into mere observation, like watching a script already written unfold before us. But God does not invite us to watch from a distance. He invites us to walk with him. And walking requires trust when the road ahead disappears into fog. Mystery is the environment in which love proves itself, where we choose to believe not because every detail is clear, but because the one we follow is trustworthy. It is in the unanswered questions, the dark nights of the soul, the silent hours of waiting, that faith grows muscles strong enough to carry us through storms. Without mystery, faith would never mature. Without unanswered questions, trust would never deepen. We may bristle against this, longing for clarity, but in reality, clarity is not always the blessing we imagine. If we knew every turn of our lives, every triumph and every trial, our hearts would not be at peace. Anticipated pain would paralyze us. Anticipated joy would make us restless, and we would live prisoners of foreknowledge rather than free children of trust. By allowing mystery, God shields us from burdens we are not meant to bear ahead of time, and grants us the grace of living one step at a time. His wisdom is not to lay out the entire path, but to give us enough light for the next step, enough courage for the next challenge, enough strength for the present hour. Delay and mystery are not voids. They are classrooms where we learn dependence and discover that God's presence is sufficient even when his plan is concealed. History is filled with stories that remind us of this truth. Joseph languished in prison for years before rising to a position of power that would save nations. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness before entering the promised land. David was anointed king, yet spent long seasons in caves hiding from Saul before the crown rested on his head. In every case, delay was preparation, mystery was formation. None of them were neglected. All of them were being readied for what lay ahead. Had they rushed the process, their character might not have been strong enough to bear the weight of their calling. God's wisdom was at work not in spite of the waiting, but through it. So it is in our own lives. The unanswered prayer, the prolonged season of uncertainty, the silence we encounter when we long for immediate direction, all these may be shaping us in ways we cannot see. Perhaps patience is being cultivated, or humility, or resilience. Perhaps the delay is not only about us, but about others who must also be prepared, circumstances that must align, or events that must mature before the answer can arrive. We imagine that the world revolves around our timeline, but Providence is weaving a tapestry far larger than our own threads. Delay and mystery remind us that we are part of a greater story, one that requires trust in an author who writes with perfect wisdom. What seems like unanswered silence may, in truth, be God whispering, "Not yet." What appears as a closed door may be his way of redirecting us to a better one. What feels like absence may actually be his nearness, teaching us to rely on presence rather than outcomes. In delay, our faith is stretched. In mystery, our dependence is deepened. These are not punishments, but invitations to a higher trust. For when the answer does finally come, when the fog does lift, when the seed does break through the soil, we will see that the waiting was not wasted and the hidden work was not in vain. Placing everything in God's hands is not weakness but strength, for only His hands can hold what ours cannot. Placing everything in God's hands is not weakness but strength, for only His hands can hold what ours cannot. Human beings have always struggled with the desire to appear strong, self-sufficient, and capable of bearing the full weight of their own lives. From the earliest stories of mankind, we see the theme repeated: the pursuit of control, the grasping for power, the desperate attempt to prove that we can carry burdens too great for our shoulders. Yet, no matter how much we labor to convince ourselves otherwise, life consistently exposes our limitations. The strongest body can grow weary, the sharpest mind can grow confused, the most disciplined will can falter under pressure. And when we finally come to the end of ourselves, we find that what we once called strength was only fragility dressed in pride. True strength lies not in grasping harder, but in letting go, not in carrying everything, but in entrusting everything into hands that never fail. We mistake surrender for defeat because we measure strength in worldly terms. The world tells us that to yield is to lose, that to depend on another is to show weakness, and that to entrust control to an unseen God is nothing more than wishful thinking. But this perspective misunderstands the nature of strength itself. The strongest tree is not the one that resists the wind with stiff defiance, for that tree is soon broken. The strongest tree is the one whose roots sink deep into the earth, allowing it to bend and sway without toppling. Its strength lies not in its own rigidity, but in its connection to the soil that anchors it. In the same way, our strength is not measured by how much we resist or carry alone, but by how deeply we are rooted in the one who upholds all things. When we place our lives, our fears, and our future into God's hands, we are not shirking responsibility but acknowledging reality. We are confessing that our resources, though valuable, are not infinite. Our wisdom, though useful, is not absolute. Our perspective, though earnest, is not eternal. Only God can see the end from the beginning. Only He knows how the pieces fit together, how the strands intertwine, how even the broken fragments can be woven into beauty. To place everything in His hands is not to abandon reason, but to align reason with truth. It is the recognition that the universe was never ours to sustain, and that our lives are safest not when clenched tightly in our fists, but when released into His care. This act of trust is not passive resignation, but the most courageous choice we can make. It takes more strength to admit dependence than to feign self-sufficiency. It requires courage to release control in a world that praises those who appear to master their destinies. And it demands faith to believe that unseen hands are more capable than our own visible ones. But when we do entrust all things into God's keeping, we begin to discover a strength that is no longer bound by our limitations. The anxieties that weighed us down lose their grip, not because the circumstances have changed, but because the burden is no longer ours to carry alone. The future that once terrified us becomes bearable, not because we know every detail, but because we know who holds it. Think of a child carrying a load too heavy for him. He struggles, stumbles, and grows weary, until at last he releases it into the arms of his father. In that moment, the burden is lifted, and what seemed impossible becomes possible. The child is not weaker because he surrendered the load. He is wiser because he recognized the strength of another. So it is with us. Life often hands us burdens we cannot carry, losses too deep, responsibilities too great, fears too heavy. To cling to them as if our strength alone could sustain us is not courage but folly. Strength is found in releasing them into the hands of the Father, who never grows weary and whose power is without end. And there is a deeper beauty here, For God's hands are not only strong, but tender. He does not hold us with cold efficiency, but with love. The same hands that shaped the stars also wiped tears from human eyes. The same hands that carved mountains also healed the broken. The same hands that hold the universe steady were stretched out upon a cross. When we place everything in His hands, we are not entrusting our lives to a distant force or impersonal power, but to a Father whose love has already been proven. This love assures us that His strength will not crush us but sustain us, that His power will not enslave us but free us, that His sovereignty will not diminish us but complete us. The paradox is that those who refuse to surrender, who insist on holding everything themselves, often find their lives collapsing under the weight. Anxiety becomes their companion, restlessness their shadow, despair their frequent guest. They are consumed by the fear of what they cannot control, driven by the endless need to hold together what was never theirs to hold, and the very strength they pride themselves on eventually breaks beneath the strain. Yet those who choose to release, to entrust, to surrender into God's hands, discover a peace that surpasses understanding. They walk lighter, not because their lives are free of difficulty, but because their burdens are carried by one whose strength is inexhaustible. Placing everything in God's hands does not mean life will be without storms. The waves will rise, the winds will howl, and the path will twist through valleys and shadows. But the difference is this: we are no longer alone at the helm. Our strength is no longer measured by our ability to quiet the sea, but by our trust in the one who commands it. When we stand in that reality, fear loses its dominion, despair loses its grip, and even in the fiercest storm, we find the unshakable security of being held.